So let me start. I'm actually also your moderator for this panel. And I know that drought has really been on everyone's mind right now, specifically with what's been happening for the last few months across California and the declarations that have been made and what happened this week with the federal declaration on the Colorado River. But I really want to focus today on measuring drought and that tying together of data and our story, the story that we need to tell. And so I'm really pleased with the panel that we've got here for you. We have a mix of academia, state board staff, and some agency folks. So we'll be able to share a lot of different perspectives on this. So I'm going to go ahead and do all the bios at once. And then we're going to give it to the panelists to give us a little bit of background, a little bit of information on what they're working on, and then we'll do questions after that. So let me go ahead and start with bios. I'll start with Elizabeth. Elizabeth Lovestead has 18 years of experience in water resources planning. She worked in water supply planning and conservation for 16 years at Eastern Municipal Water District, and in April of 2019 joined the San Diego County Water Authority as a water resources manager. She first served as the steering committee chair for the California Data Collaborative while at Eastern, and is currently the chair for the Water Use Subcommittee for the Association of California Water Agencies. So thank you, Elizabeth, for paving the way. Elizabeth has a bachelor's degree of science in civil engineering from San Diego State University and is a registered civil engineer. We also have Amy Talbot with us. Amy received a bachelor's degree in urban studies from the Department of Geography and the Environment from the University of Texas at Austin, and a master's in geography from the University of California at Davis, focusing on supplier drought response. Ms. Talbot joined the Regional Water Authority, a coalition of more than 20 water purveyors and associated agencies in the greater Sacramento region in November of 2012. RWA's mission is to represent regional water supply interests and to assist members in protecting and enhancing the reliability, affordability, availability, and quality of water resources. At RWA, Amy is the manager of the Regional Water Efficiency Program's award-winning public outreach campaign and school education program. Additionally, she is the California-Nevada AWWA Water Loss Committee Chair and has been actively engaged in statewide water loss policy for several years. Marielle Pinheiro is a research data specialist in the Office of Research, Planning, and Performance at the State Water Resources Control Board. She has a bachelor's in environmental science from UC Berkeley and a PhD in atmospheric science from UC Davis. At the board, her work includes the collection and analysis of multiple data sets, including the electronic annual report, the 2020 COVID impact survey, and the Urban Water Suppliers Monthly Conservation Data Set. And last but not least, Dr. Michael Dettinger retired from being a senior research hydrologist for the U.S. Geological Survey's Water Cycle Branch in 2019 after 38 years of studies of climate and water resources in the Western U.S., and is now a visiting researcher at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, the Center for Western Water and Weather Extremes, and a distinguished visiting researcher at the Desert Research Institute. Dettinger continues his research on hydroclimatic variability and extremes, including atmospheric rivers and droughts, and climate change impacts and adaptations. He is a fellow of the American Geophysical Union and the Association for the Advancement of Science, is the recipient of 2 California Climate Science Service Awards and a Career Special Recognition Award from the California Extreme Precipitation Symposium. He was the lead author on the Water Resources chapter of the 2013 National Climate Assessment, co-edited State of the Bay Delta Science Reports in 2008 and 2016, and led the California 4th Climate Change Assessment Sierra Nevada Region Project in 2018. This year, he is honored by the selection to give the Tidal History of Global Environmental Change lecture at the AGU Fall Meeting. So what an amazing panel. Thank you all so much for being here. We very much appreciate it. And so I think Elizabeth was kind enough to offer to share her screen and bring up these slides for us, but we are going to start with Dr. Dettinger. So Elizabeth, if you could bring those up, and then I will hand over the floor. All right.
Hopefully you can hear me. Good. So can you hear me? Yes, no.
Kind of quiet. We can do a little bit, but if you could speak up a bit, I think that would be helpful.
Okay. Anyway, so I'm Mike Dettinger, and I have to tell you that I'm a climatologist as well as a hydrologist. Me about measuring drought. I'm bound. I tell you about it from looking from the top down, from the atmosphere down. So it's probably than we might hear about from some of the other folks who will tend to perhaps be more focused on impacts and on mitigation against drought. But what I wanted to do today real quickly was to just kind of touch on 2 points that are shown here on the title slide. I want to talk a little bit about, in quotes, the other face of the current drought, and I'll tell you what that means in a sec, as well as I want to give you a really quick, I'm sure because time will run out, run through some work that we're doing at the Public Policy Institute of California on trying to create some grid-savvy drought indicators and what sorts of data we will need to do that. I took the charge to talk about what data we need and use real seriously here. Elizabeth, could you bump me forward actually a couple, like 3 slides to the one where there'll be 2 big blue ovals up at the top? So I'm going to just dive right in. Yeah, this one. So I'm going to just dive right in, and you know, most often we think about drought, we think about a period when there's less precipitation than normal. Historically, that's been the primary way that we characterize droughts. But the current drought has really tended to catch a lot of us, I think, in California a little bit off guard, surprising us by how quickly we've dropped into severe drought conditions. Our reservoirs, our water supplies, and our wildfire risks have just sort of gone from pretty well too long ago in 2019 to as bad as anything we saw in 2012, 2015, or 1977. We just went there very quickly. And that's surprising because, over the last 2 years, we've gotten about 60% of normal precipitation at the state level. But this dive into drought seems like it's happening faster than that would dictate. And so the other side of drought is one that I've heard mentioned several times today, and that's the evaporative demand, the ETO, as was referenced a couple times. And on this slide, I just sort of note that that if the precipitation was below normal, like it has been, and evaporative demand was normal, then keeping a lawn well watered would require an extra amount of water equal to the missing precipitation. Precipitation is normal, and in the ETO, the evaporative demand is elevated above normal, then keeping that same lawn well watered would require an extra amount equal to that ETO surplus. And the point here being that these act in very much the same way. Precipitation deficits and evaporative demand surpluses are kind of 2 sides of the same coin. And I guess I should note right here and now that in this drought, we're seeing, a really highly elevated ETO along with the precipitation deficit. Every drop of water that falls in the sky will get less runoff, less water showing up in the reservoirs, vegetation's drier and all that than it would be if the ETO wasn't, if the evaporative demand wasn't elevated. Under climate change, I'll also note that that ETO, the evaporative demand, will increase, arguably on the order of 15 to 20% by late this century. So next slide, please. This is well, there's several things going on in this diagram. So I'll just say, all I'm doing here is going to compare for you how much extra evaporative demand we're talking about, and in this case at the California scale. Like I said, I'm a top-down sort of scientist. On the right and on the left and in the center here on these yellowish maps, I'm showing the precipitation deficits accumulated over the course of the drought to date, and the evaporative demand surpluses, both on the same color bar, and everything is labeled there in terms of millimeters. You can see that in the mountains, the precipitation deficits are quite high, have been quite high in the Sacramento Valley and over into the northern coastal ranges. The evaporative demand surpluses have been kind of astonishingly high. These are in millimeters because I'm a scientist, but these could be in inches, or they could be, just relabel the thing, could be in feet. And so if I accumulate these numbers all over the entire state of California, I could come up with the number of missing acre feet of precipitation, the number of extra acre feet of ETO surplus. And I'm just going to compare the two to give you a sense of what this extra part of the drought is that's a lot more invisible to us than are the precipitation deficits. Down at the bottom. So if I do that business of just adding up the total precipitation deficit and the total ETO surplus, what I find is that the total extra demand over California so far in this drought is equal to about 2/3 of the amount that is the total precipitation deficit. So it's a huge fraction in addition to the drought, to the precipitation drought that we're dealing with. That's the main point here. On the right there in green and red, I just sort of say what part of that total ETO plus precipitation drought forcing is due to the precipitation not being there. The reds are where the precipitation is dominant, the dominant thing causing the drought. The greens are where the ETO, extra ETO, is the dominant thing driving the dryness. And what you see there is, some green, some red. In the mountains, you see the Sierra and the coastal ranges. You see the reds, which are that the precipitation is missing. But if again, taking over the whole state, if I just ask how much of the area of California does the extra demand exceed or roughly equal the precipitation deficits on a point-by-point basis over the entire state of California, you find almost 50% of the state has the evaporative demand being much larger than the precipitation deficit or roughly equal to it. And so, this is a big deal. And frankly, we don't measure this well enough. This is data, this is all based on data about the evaporative demands that we didn't have commonly available to us at the beginning of the 2012-2015 drought. This is stuff that we really weren't able to look at this way in the past. And as I said earlier, climate change is likely to drive these evaporative demands, through the roof. And ultimately, that map on the right there will, in future droughts, look greener and greener and greener, more and more of an ETO dominance. So in terms of what data do we need to track future, we really need to get a handle on the evaporative demand. Right now, we have the CMIS system, the California Irrigation Management Information System, that measures these evaporative demands directly, but they're basically, they're mostly in the lowland agricultural valley. We need them up where our water supplies come from, where our forest fires happen and all that sort of thing. And we just need to fill in this other face of the drought. Next slide. Okay, now I'm really going to have to go fast. And I just want to talk to you a little bit about this effort we've got going at the Public Policy Institute, where most of you, well, hopefully all of you recognize the map that I'm showing here, which is a recent U.S. drought monitor for the western states. And the deep reds and into bloody colors are, extremely severe. And my main point here is that this drought monitor, which is what gets used for a lot of ag insurance and for a lot of decision making, is a local drought map. It tells you what the drought conditions are at any point on the map. But in California, we've got these large state scale and regional scale water grids that that mean that the drought that we experience, for instance, in the water district area, is not strictly a function of the color of this map, like in LA County or something like that. So what we've been doing at PPIC, next slide, is we're working with the National Integrated Drought Information System folks at NOAA to develop some new metrics of drought that are as well grid savvy is what we tend to call them. And we're putting together these regional drought hazard dashboards. So this is what one would look like for the Sacramento River hydrologic region, and these little maps up at the top that's what the Sacramento River region looks like on the map. But anyway, we're following all these various variables that describe various aspects of drought. And each of them are at a different level of drought, different severity of drought at any given time. We want to take these, put them together, and turn out a series of sectoral drought conditions. So drought for the urban area, the cities in that region, it's going to be a different flavor of drought or feeling of drought than the irrigated agriculture drought and that sort of thing. And so we've got all these little dials over the lower right that are examples of how you might have different levels of drought severity for the different sectors. And then we also want to actually ultimately mush them together to form an overall regional drought severity index that is there in the lower left. Next slide. So in order to do that, we have to somehow mush all these together, as I say, to use the technical term. We basically are we're in the process of developing weights such that, regions and some sectors, snow may be utterly irrelevant, or there's no groundwater, or it's all groundwater, or you can any of those examples. We need to somehow come up with ways of weighting these, come up with a in practice practical drought index that reflects how much imported water they rely on and what's going on, where they get the water from, all that sort of thing. Next slide. The trick we're struggling now is to come up with a reasonable, rational, and defensible way of developing those weights. And what we're looking at are the water supply portfolios for various regions and sectors that we get from DWR and from the state board and that sort of thing. Here's a record for the Sacramento River ag sector of where they were getting their waters in every year from 2002 to 2016. This allows us to dive in and say, okay, but during the drought years, where did they get their water? And next slide. The idea being that we then use those how much people relied on, how much sectors relied on those various water supplies, water sources to translate the drought conditions on the top row here through the portfolio, these overall sectoral and regional drought conditions. Next slide. And this is where I close it out. I'm sorry I've probably gone over, but just in terms of, as I say, I took the question of what should we be measuring for the future, to heart. And again, I believe we need to pay more attention looking forward to filling in our evaporative demand side data for characterizing California droughts. We've got it in some places, but often not where our water sources are or where our water uses are. And it's starting to hit our inflows to reservoirs and things like that. And then the other bit is that we need those kind of grid savvy metrics. We need, I would say, more publicly available, if possible, more information where the various agencies are getting their water from. I know that there are privacy issues and proprietary information issues, and frankly, political issues with having that be entirely freely available. But we kind of need to keep track of that, of what we're doing with the grid, in order to understand what the drought on the ground ends up meaning to the actual water users. So, sorry if I went over, but
that's okay. That was great. Thank you so much. How interesting. So, you know, to expose my own ignorance here, when I think about drought, I think about how much precipitation is there, how much water do we have, and how much do we use. But I've never really thought about how much of it is evaporating, and has that changed? So that's a really, really, really interesting measurement that that we need to look at. So thanks for sharing that. And I really like what Lauren said here, that grid savvy metric is really like unbundling all of those drought indicators to give us a better sense of what's happening. So that's great. Thank you so much. So next I will turn it over to Marielle, and we'll let you give your presentation. Thank you.
All right. Well, hello there. I'm kind of the baby on this panel. I've only been at this job for like a year and a half, so I feel, you know, a little intimidated by this amazing panel here, but I'll do my best. This presentation had kind of evolved a few times before I came up with a finished version. But I'm going to sort of, I guess, start with a very broad perspective and then zoom in a little bit. So if you could go ahead and go to the next slide. Some version of this image was, you sort of saw it floating around the media during the last drought. So this is a chart of drought area index, which essentially shows how much area was in drought for like a given amount of time. This particular one, it goes all the way back to the 800s. They use tree rings to sort of do a historical reconstruction. Overall, the Western United States, it does tend towards semi-arid conditions, but there have been times in the past when the drought, you know, covered a much larger proportionate area, as represented by these red areas in the chart. And there were mega droughts that lasted for up to 200 years. So, you know, in contrast, go over all the way to the right side of the chart, and we can see that for almost the entirety of California statehood, that area is almost entirely blue. So, you know, all the infrastructure that was built, all the decision-making that's been done around water took place in a time when there were less areas of the state that were dry. That little red bump at the very end shows that things started to change in the early 2000s, which is unfortunately also when I don't have any more data to plot. But if we move on to the next slide, we sort of zoom in a little bit more closely into the last few decades, where we can see that even during that supposedly wetter than normal period prior to the 2000s, we experienced, you know, a couple of droughts, one in 76 to 77, one in 87 to 92. The drought in the 70s was short, but it was pretty intense, with statewide runoff being some of the lowest since 1900 at the time. And so afterwards, we started to see some statewide efforts aimed at conservation, such as fixture efficiency regulations and Urban Water Management Plan Act, which required suppliers to begin doing supply and demand management plans every 5 years. The longer drought that started in 87 was further motivation to start doing drought contingency planning and investing in conservation programs. Then in the 2000s, we started to see fewer wet periods overall and longer and more intense dry periods. So 2012 to 2016 drought, that's the one that everybody talks about now, but you might recall we also had another one from 2007 to 2009. So these two drought periods brought forth conservation legislation such as SBX 7x7, SB 606, and AB 1668, which required statewide urban water use to be lowered with the goal of making conservation a California way of life. Next slide, please. So the majority of precipitation in California is very heavily concentrated into just a few months in the winter and early spring, and that's a big factor in determining what the rest of the year's water usage is going to look like. This chart shows per capita water use in California against a backdrop of precipitation anomalies, with the red areas representing months with less rain than average. So with the exception of mandatory water use restrictions in 2015, it's a pretty consistent pattern. Use goes up in the summer, and sometimes also if there's less rain, it'll also go up during a winter month. So 2021 is now the second year in a row where we've seen less rain than average, and there have been corresponding spikes in overall per capita water use relative to previous years. Next slide, please. So that last drought was what prompted the State Water Board to begin collecting monthly data from urban water suppliers and tracking savings relative to a 2013 baseline. After we entered a drought state of emergency in 2014, we needed to be able to get more timely data than we were collecting at the time. And there's a little boo-boo on this slide, unfortunately. So we began collecting data in August of 2014 for June 2014 onwards, because there's a little bit of lag in the data and when we collect it. So after the lowest snowpack in recorded history at the time was observed in 2015, that's when a 25% target reduction was declared. Suppliers were assigned a savings target based on per capita use. So for example, a water supplier with per capita residential use of 80 gallons per day would have a 16% target. And a supplier with a higher per capita use target would get a higher, correspondingly higher savings target, capping out at 36%. The goal was to achieve 25% savings statewide with these targets. This was later altered to account for factors such as local climate conditions, population density, lot size, and income. So the stress test further allowed suppliers an alternative to their target if they were able to self-certify that they had sufficient supplies for an additional 3 dry years. The conservation standards were rescinded once the drought emergency declaration was lifted. However, as shown previously, things will probably never go back to the way they were before these actions were put in place. Even now, in the midst of another drought, we're still 16% below where we were in 2013 in terms of consumption. Next slide, please. So we started collecting this information because of that last drought, but we never stopped collecting it. It became voluntary for a period of time after the emergency declaration was lifted. But even then, about 80% of suppliers continued to give us data. So awesome, we will always take data. In the service of continuing to reliably get a sense of statewide water use, the board underwent a rulemaking to make reporting mandatory again back in April of 2020, and the mandatory reporting was reinstated starting in October of last year. Next slide, please. So this data set has evolved quite a bit since its inception, but in its most current form, we try to do essentially a more streamlined version of some of the bigger reports that are required on an annual basis. So we collect basic information on things like service area, population, and production, how much of that water use is residential. If the agency is undergoing a supply shortage, we'll ask some additional questions about any actions that are being undertaken to address it, whether it be like some sort of a media blitz campaign, drought surcharges, or limitations on water use. Next slide, please. So if you're interested in viewing this data yourself, you can find it either on our conservation portal or on the open data portal. So the link to the conservation portal is down there at the bottom of that slide. The data is released after the results are presented to the board in the month following the submission deadline. There is a 2-month lag between the data set release and the data itself. Just keep that in mind. If you just want to quickly peruse some selective results, there's a Tableau dashboard that's on the conservation portal where you can look at things like per supplier use and other stuff like that. Next slide, please. Now, with the way things are at the moment, this data set has been getting a lot more attention. As of this past week, 95% of the state is in at least severe drought, with a sizable chunk in extreme or exceptional drought. Therefore, pretty much everyone except a few counties in south of the state and the San Francisco area are under the latest drought declaration, which covers about 42% of the state's population. However, even some agencies that don't fall under that declaration have taken local actions as well. Next slide, please. So the governor's July 8th executive order calls for a voluntary 15% reduction in use relative to 2020. As you can see on the chart, this roughly tracks with what we saw in terms of 2015 to 2016 total production when conservation targets were in effect. So we're going to be measuring that progress in terms of cumulative statewide total production starting in July. Next slide, please. So as I said, we're going to be starting assessing it with July 2021 data and then reporting to the board every month after that. However, before we can do that, there's still data gaps. So about a quarter of suppliers have one or more months of missing data for 2020 because that took place during that period of time where reporting was still voluntary. So yesterday, I just spent all day emailing about 100 suppliers, just asking them to give me their data, and then we'll be using the electronic annual report to fill in any remaining gaps. So it's an ongoing effort. And next slide. Stay tuned because the data is yet to come, and we'll see. If you have any further questions, I'm the main contact for this data set. My email's right here.
Yeah, thank you. And so feel free again, everyone, to put your questions in the chat. I see Dr. Dettinger has been answering them all along the way. And Marielle, if you could do that too, that would be awesome. But I think there's probably not a person on this call right now who hasn't been plagued by data gaps before. But I am glad I didn't have to email 100 water agencies yesterday. So at this time, I will hand it over to Amy for our next presentation.
All right, can you hear me? Okay, perfect. All right, next slide, please. All right, just wanted to give a little bit of background about Regional Water Authority. We are a membership organization representing 20 public and private water suppliers in the 5-county Sacramento region. We collectively deliver water to over 2 million people, and our mission is to improve water supply reliability, availability, quality, and affordability. And you can see on the map kind of the reach that we go. Next slide, please. Okay, just want to jump right in, talking about how we measure drought. In addition to the more kind of traditional ways to measure drought, like snowpack and reservoir inflow and capacity, our region suppliers are part of what we call the Water Forum Agreement. This was signed in 2000. It's a partnership between environmental, business, agriculture, and water supplier stakeholders that came together to create a locally decided comprehensive framework for sustainable water use in the region. You can kind of see all the different parts that combine to I guess, roll up to what the agreement means in the graphic to your right there. And the agreement contains a matrix based on water supply conditions like flow and temperature that really guide the water supply related actions in the region, especially in times of drought. So how that kind of works is it would be basically like if runoff and temperature are X, we do Y. If runoff and temperature are A, we do B. So there's a series of conditions that result in resulting actions. And then the region constantly reassesses these metrics and may revisit the water supply decisions based on that over time. Next slide, please. So what does this kind of look like? This is from the Water Forum website. You can kind of see here what metrics that we are constantly kind of tracking, and that they involve storage, temperature, because a part of the agreement is to care for the health of the fish in the Lower American River. And then you can see flows as well, incoming flows. So next slide, please. So how we measure drought in the region really stems from how we prepare for drought. Since the last drought, the region's invested in about 20 infrastructure projects to increase the shifting, mostly through conjunctive use and sharing of water between suppliers. Sample projects include kind of additional groundwater wells and interties between agencies that weren't previously matched. And we're really trying to get closer to treating our 20 separate agencies more like a single regional system. So, the projects that we are putting into the region improve the reliability of each agency, therefore improving the reliability of the region as a whole. So why do we do all this? Why do we go for the effort? Well, because it works. One example of that, even this year, is a few of our agencies received curtailment orders responding to this drought. And we've been able to alleviate that lost supply for those agencies within our own region from other sources that are available and from other agencies. So in a sense, we're kind of better together. And I know that's been kind of a theme, for this presentation. And what we're doing now is we're really trying to formalize these projects, this shifting and sharing into a regional water bank. So we want to account for some of the activities that we're doing now, but also incentivize future operations. A water bank can create opportunities like groundwater substitution transfers that produce revenue that could be used to continue to invest in the region in conjunctive use, which could yield more conjunctive use in the future. And we really see the water bank as a way to reinvest in this regional system that we are building based on increasing the reliability of individual agencies. And the goal of all of this is to better prepare for tomorrow's hydrology. We know that it's changing. We've seen that it's changing, and the increased impacts of climate change. And then just below here in the pie chart, you can see as a testament to the potential of the water bank in our region, the pie chart shows sources and how we can shift surface water and groundwater between wet and dry years. Next slide, please. Furthermore, you can kind of see from this map that the groundwater levels in our region have been increasing due to the near $1 billion in investment in conjunctive use practices over the last several decades. The kind of green light status was obtained not by accident. I guarantee you it's through a lot of hard work and investment in the region, and we're motivated to do even more, to get even better. And this is what we can do this is what we can do as a region based on our unique conditions and supply availabilities. But I just wanted to this might not be possible for all parts of the state. And there are solutions that are being implemented in other places that we couldn't do and probably shouldn't do as a region. And that's why I really think it's important to kind of play to your strengths, like identify what you have in your region, what's available, what partnerships exist, what hydrology are you working with, and then kind of taking all that in and creating your own version of reliability. So I show this, in a sense of what we can do, but I know that, others can do other things. Next slide, please. Okay. So we went over kind of how we prepare for drought, and I wanted to talk about how we monitor it. So I know that a lot of people, we think about how do we monitor it? It's all about the savings. We all care about the savings. But I guess I have a different perspective on that. I think we think of savings, but we really do the savings to reduce demand to match that reduced supply. So for me, it's all about the supply. But you get there, I guess, kind of through savings. So I don't know. It's like a chicken egg kind of thing. But I do think there are some issues with focusing just solely on supply. For instance, whatever baseline you choose makes a big difference. If you calculate savings compared to 2013 versus 2020, you're going to get different numbers. Also, if you look at the couple of charts below here, you'll see our monthly production for 2020 in million gallons. You can notice that in January, our use is pretty low. In August, it triples. You know, I guess that we would expect to see that. So if you have a percent reduction, you know, and 15% in January, you're going to get a different volume than 15% in August. So there are some kind of quirks between, you know, relying just on savings numbers, knowing that you're going to get different volumes depending on different months of the year. If you're in an area like ours where our monthly use does deviate a lot, that's not true for everywhere in the state, but especially in our region. And then below that, you can see average precipitation and average temperature. And I mean, that kind of partially explains that bump. You know, we have no rain, we have high temperatures in the summer, we have rain and lower temperatures in the winter. So you just have to be conscious of all that while you're trying to monitor your drought. And then you're like, I didn't get a lot of savings this month. But you're like, okay, well, why didn't that happen? Next slide. So how do we reduce that demand to match that reduced supply through the savings? For me, I focus on messaging and I keep it simple, sassy, and then media. So it's between customer messaging and then also involving the media. So like one of the things that we're doing now is we are partnering with News 10 with Monica Wood. She's giving our water savings tips during the weather forecast. And then for messaging, we're really focusing on our stress lawn save trees. So water less for your overall lawn, but make sure paying special attention to your trees because those don't bounce back as well after a drought. We also focus on research-based focus groups. You can see that cat image there. That didn't work well. And we did a focus group and we did not release that one. So we wanted people to like think, oh, there's an animal in the backyard or overwatering this poor animal. But everyone just focused on the animal and did not get the overwatering message at all. They did not care. And so we did a focus group, realized that didn't work and took it out and redirected. So make sure research-based and focus groups. We don't have a lot of money. So when we do use our money, we want it to go and make sure it's getting through. Then you've got to look at behavior versus efficiency. Those are slightly different. Sometimes you need one, sometimes you need neither, sometimes you need both. Same thing for considering indoor and outdoor actions. The majority of the state's use in residential areas is outdoors. So we tend to focus on outdoor, but indoor is also worthy as well. So you just have to kind of make those choices. And then we message no waste anytime, never, no, depending on the weather, it's never okay to waste is kind of our bottom line message. And then there's, you know, the role of incentives, which is important to kind of tailor along with your messaging. And we've got about $1 million right now in grant funding to help with incentives throughout the region. And I do think they're worthy, but they're not everything. You need to match them with the messaging. The rebates alone don't get you there. Next slide.
So Amy, we are starting to run behind. So if you can get through the next few slides quickly, we would appreciate it.
Of course, I can do that. Okay, so just a couple samples here. For this drought, we're focusing on a 15% reduction. This is the infographic. We are kind of tailoring all our messaging around that. The overwatering one is the image we ended up using. We tried to get a little humor in there to try to draw people in, but we didn't use the cat. You know, we already went over that. And then Drought Face is our special campaign that we did indoors during the last drought. We partnered with the Sacramento Beard and Mustache Club, and this is one of the gentlemen from there. And we had billboards from the winners from our campaign. Next slide. And then this is it. So I just wanted to say with drought, conservation is a piece of what you do, but it's not everything.
Great. Thank you, Amy. Thanks for sharing all of that experience. And Elizabeth, take it away.
I really appreciate being invited to present at the summit and really enjoy being here. And I've learned a whole lot. And I really like this theme of telling the story. And I think data really does help us tell our stories. And so just a little bit about the San Diego County Water Supply. We're the wholesale supplier to 24 member agencies down in San Diego. A unique aspect of our service area is that we really don't have a whole lot of natural local resources. We have surface water, stormwater runoff, and surface storage, but we don't have a lot of groundwater, and that's really kind of, and we're kind of at the end of the pipeline, right? Because water's coming either from the north or it's coming from the Colorado River. We're kind of at the end of the road there. So one of the things that we really, are looking at as we look forward to the next couple of years is, are we ready for drought? What do we need to do? One of the things we know is that our service area has done a lot of conservation. We've knocked our gallons per capita per day down by about 50% over the last 30 years. So it's really kind of a way of life. We have high priority rights on the Colorado River. We have drought resilient supplies, including that seawater desalination plant that was part of the quiz earlier today. And then our region's water supplies are really reliable, even in multiple dry year droughts. And where this really kind of started is back in the early 1990s. We were facing up to a 50% water delivery cut. And again, we were heavily reliant, 95% reliant on imported water back then. And fortunately, we kind of had the miracle March, and it reduced the amount of cutback, and it kind of saved us. But back then, in those early 90s, the community said, hey, this is not good for our economy. We need reliability. We need to invest in water resources, and let's change this. So we really have tried to move beyond just relying on imported water and make sure that there's diversity throughout our community. We have made several investments on imported water from the Colorado River. Our member agencies have made investments in reclaimed water. As I said, we've done a lot of conservation. Where we can, we've treated groundwater that needs to be purified as well. We have several agencies that are working on potable reuse projects. And then we have our California desal plant. And so these projects over the last 30 years have involved billions of dollars in investments. And again, it's just so that when we were facing a drought, we had options, we had a large portfolio, and we had a lot to move forward with. We did invested in local water storage. So again, when we had those wet years, we could store that water for the dry years. We invested in additional treatment plants so we could treat raw water and have more flexibility there. Hundreds of millions have been invested in water use efficiency since the early 90s. We have pipeline relining to make sure that we're not, we don't lose a pipeline or we're not suffering a lot of water loss. And then we have a desalination plant that gives us about 10% of our supply. And then we have the All-American and Coachella Canal lining project. So our supply and demand in 2020 looks a lot different than that 1990 supply and demand. We went from being 95% reliant on imported water from Metropolitan to having Imperial Irrigation District water transfers that again are water that we've done through conservation and the other projects from the Colorado River. We do rely about 20% from Metropolitan, and then we have local service water about 10%, and then our seawater desalination. So this was a cartoon that was in our local paper back in April, and really kind of showed that we know that there's a drought ahead. We're prepared for it, but even though we're prepared, we're still making sure we're still watching things, and we're still being conscious of what's going on around the state and with the Colorado River and the State Water Project, and making sure that we stay vigilant and support the efforts of the statewide efforts to reduce water supply. Again, we have the tips and the top 10 ways to live water smart. That seems to be a popular motto. And then our outreach, stay water smart. We've got this, we've done this before. We know how to cut back. We know how to save water. Our education programs, we have landscape classes for both residential and professional customers. We have indoor conservation programs that focus on low-income customers and partnering with our energy provider that have mutual benefits. And then we have outdoor programs that again, offer those, turf replacements for residential and large landscape customers, and then devices like sprinklers and nozzles. So all those things are there. We're promoting them. And what we see is you kind of hear that drought messaging in the news. It's becoming a story. We see that our program starting to pick up. Participation in our programs start to pick up as well. So on a monthly basis, we have several different reports that we produce. We have a local water resource data report that we put out, and it tracks, again, local rainfall, statewide rainfall, what were our sales, what were our member agency sales, what was the water use in the area, and then what are the level of all our local reservoirs and reservoirs across the state. We also do a monthly statewide condition report to our board to let them know, hey, we've got these supplies in storage, we've got this supply, but this is what the outlook is, and this is what we're doing across the state. Our continued conservation activities are tracked, and then we also look at what are the impacts on water use. And again, like Amy was talking about, what is the local weather here? How has that changed? Where's the past conservation been? Is that affecting how much people can save? What is population changed? Have there been changes in the landscape? And then our water supply resiliency, where are we at with that? Do we have supplies in there? Do we need to make adjustments? So next steps, we're going to just continue closely following that statewide and local supply and demand conditions. And I think one of the great things about the legislation that was passed after the last drought is changes to the urban water management plans, and the local supply and demand assessment really kind of give the state a better picture of where we are, not just climate-wise and weather-wise, but we also look at where our supplies and demands are. Adjust outreach in our conservation programs as necessary, and then plan for our water shortage contingency plan implementation. Again, that was a big part of the legislation that was passed, making sure that water shortage contingency plans were applicable for the region and they were implementable. And so we worked with our member agencies to make sure everyone had their water shortage contingency plan in a place that it can be implemented if needed during this current drought. And that's it.
Well, thank you. And thank you for going through that quickly. I do appreciate that. It's so good to hear the local perspectives from both Amy and Elizabeth on how they're measuring it at their own agency basis, as well as hearing a statewide perspective and a much larger perspective. So thank you all so much.